Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our live stream for today. I'm glad to have you here. Hello from beautiful sunny Los Angeles. It's 82 degrees, blue sky. I hope it's lovely wherever you are. I could use some fall weather about now. It's been really hot. Uh, so if you're somewhere where it's already fall, and it's cool, crisp air, and you're enjoying pumpkin spice lattes or hot chocolates or warm apple cider or whatever it is you like in the fall, then I'm a little bit jealous because I don't want any of those things when it's in the 80s. Anyway, uh, let's go ahead and get started with the topic for today, which we're going to be continuing our series on semantic HTML. So today is part 2. And our next stream 2 weeks from today will be part 3, and that will wrap up the series on semantic HTML. And if you want to follow along with the information that I'm presenting and try out the exercises, then you can go to the website I'm showing on the screen right now, which is poshfoundations.tech. So on that website, you will see all of the information I'm presenting, links out to the exercises and um, the the answers to the exercises. But just a reminder that the answers that I am proposing for those exercises are not the only correct answers. So if you do something different, that doesn't mean it's wrong. If you do try one of the exercises and you want me to take a look, you can send me a comment on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, or send me a comment on LinkedIn. And either way, I'll see it and I'll take a look at your exercise and give you some feedback to it. All right, so let me give you a quick little tour of this website. I know we did it in part 1, but just in case we have any people joining us who didn't see last time. So along the top of the screen, we have some options. When I was putting this together, I was giving a lot of thought to what would be the most accessible. Is it a dark background? Is it a light background? Is it bright yellow text? Is it purple text? And I decided that the most accessible is allowing people to choose. So whatever works best for you. So the site will default to whatever your system preferences are for light or dark background, but you can switch it. So mine is set to dark, but you could switch to a light background if you prefer. And then you'll see like the links and other emphasis text, I guess, or accent colors, I guess, are all in blue. That is the default color, which is Azure. If you prefer a different color, you can just pick it from the top. Maybe we'll go with violet today for me. But if you're following along, set it to whatever you want. Change it every slide. It's all up to you. And then once we get into the slides, you do have this button here to hide the side menu so that the slide content fills more of the screen. And also once we go into one of the units, there are these handy buttons for navigating back one slide, forward one slide, and getting around in there. So last time we went through Unit 1 and Unit 2. So today we're going to be tackling Unit 3 and Unit 4. So hello to everybody who's in the chat. I see one anonymous user because my my streaming platform is, outside of LinkedIn. So if you have your LinkedIn profile set so that it's not public, it's just going to show me LinkedIn user as your name, who said good afternoon. So good afternoon to you. And then I see Dave Den on YouTube and Sam on LinkedIn. So hello to everybody. Thank you for joining me today. All right, let's go ahead and dive into the Unit 3 content here. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the menu. And we'll just scroll down so that we've got this first slide. The slides are programmed to automatically fill the height of your screen. If your screen isn't tall enough, then you'll have to scroll a little bit to see the rest of the slide. But it should work if you need to zoom in. Everything should still work for you. If you run into any problems, let me know and I'll make sure I get them fixed. All right, so Unit 3 is all about lists, tables, and relationships. So this is something I see people getting wrong all the time on websites when I'm testing them for accessibility. So let's talk about how we should be approaching these things. So first, list items. So we have 3 different kinds of lists in HTML. And if that surprises you and you thought there was just unordered lists and ordered lists, well, meet the definition list. So we'll talk about these 3 different types of lists today. So an unordered list, or a UL tag, is great for items that are just part of a group that we want to semantically communicate that here's a bunch of things that all go together. An ordered list is good for, as it says in the name, when the order of those items matters, when it's steps in a process. As an example, a ranking of some kind, right? Then the order becomes important, and we would want to use an OL tag. Definition lists are helpful for terms and descriptions, but as we'll see a little bit later on, they can be used for a few other things as well. So I could, if I had, if I wanted to list out, my 5 favorite books in a blog post, I could definitely put those in paragraph tags. But the drawbacks of putting those in paragraph tags is that it's not going to communicate to search engines, to assistive technology, etc., that those things belong to part of a group, that they go together, right? They're just paragraphs. So when we wrap them up in a list tag, we are communicating programmatically that here's a set of things that go together. And probably you could be using lists more often than you are. Just given what I've generally seen on the internet, I think people could generally use more lists as long as they're getting used correctly. All right, so unordered list, just a quick review of this in case you haven't seen it in a while. We use an UL tag and a /UL tag to open and close the list. And then inside of that list, we can have any number of LI elements, which stands for list item. So UL is unordered list, LI is list item. And we can keep going infinitely. You can have as many as you like. The nice thing is that assistive technology, when it lands on an unordered list, it will tell the person who is using that assistive technology how many items are in your list. So it will announce, hey, here's a list. It's got 10 things in it. So that way the users know exactly what to expect and they can navigate through that list item by item. It makes it really nice, a lot nicer than trying to navigate through a bunch of paragraphs. We can also nest ordered lists. Now you need to make sure that you get the tags in the right order. So you can see that if you want to put a UL inside another UL, it has to be inside an LI. So you can see I've got the opening LI tag here and the closing LI tag here, and the nested UL is entirely contained within that other list item. So you do need to make sure you get those tags in the right order. And again, like, you can nest infinitely. If you want to have 100 lists nested inside of one another, you can. I don't recommend it because it does get a little bit unwieldy from a usability standpoint. So maybe, maybe for some kind of special case that might make sense. But for the most part, you'd want to keep it to maybe no more than two or three levels deep. But again, it depends on what you're doing. You could make a pretty good case for having more nested lists than that. And again, the unordered lists are for when order doesn't matter. It's just a group of things. All I want to communicate is here's a group of things that belong together. All right, the ordered list. It's pretty much the exact same syntax, exact same markup, and exact same roles, except we switch out that letter U for a letter O. So we have an opening and closing OL tag, can have however many LI tags we would like to have inside of it. And again, we can nest them. OL tags get interesting because we actually do have quite a few options for how they get numbered. By default, they just number as you see over here on the right-hand side of the screen with just the, I think that we call these Arabic numerals, just Arabic numerals with a dot after them and a little space and then your item. So that's what happens by default. But if you need to change that to uppercase Roman numerals or lowercase Roman numerals or letters, you can do that. So that's CSS properties, actually, CSS style properties that you can adjust. So if you want your lists to look a little bit different, you can do that. You can do the same thing with unordered lists. So by default, they get the solid disk, the solid little bullet point in front of them, but you could also have a square or an open circle. And I think that might be it by default, but there are other styling options for those as well. Sometimes it's nice to use, if you have nested lists, to use something different on the inside, right? So if you have an unordered list, to have those solid bullets for the top level and then maybe open bullets for the inside, it helps to kind of visually reinforce that nesting. And then you could do the same thing with ordered lists, where maybe the top level list gets the numbers and then one level down gets letters. And those letters could be either lower or uppercase. So you have a lot of different options. And if you remember doing your report outline, right, in elementary school, where you'd have like the Roman numeral at level 1 and then a capital letter A, and then I think the number 1, and then it went to a lowercase letter A once you were inside that. You could do all of that. You can get very fancy. And then just a reminder, the ordered lists are for when the order matters. There's some reason that these items are being presented in this order. All right, and then our definition list. So this one, it gets a little bit different. We use a DL tag around the whole thing. And instead of single items inside, right, for OL and UL, we just use an LI tag inside. For definition lists, we actually have pairs of tags that go together. So we have a DT tag, which is our term, and a DD tag, which is our definition. And by default, they will be presented like this, with the term aligned to the left margin and the definition indented a little bit. That is completely customizable with CSS. If you don't like that way of it being presented, you can change it and make it whatever you would like. In fact, there is a weird little quirk of definition lists in that you can add a div around the DT and the DD tag to wrap them together. So that's really handy for cases where maybe you want to put them side by side. It's really handy to have that extra container around them. It makes the CSS styling so much easier, and that does not cause invalid HTML. If you tried to do that with an ordered list or an unordered list, you tried to wrap a div around your LIs, it's not going to pass an HTML validator. That is invalid HTML, and you might get some unexpected results. And a lot of accessibility checkers, like automated checkers, are going to flag that as an issue. However, with a DL, with a definition list, that is absolutely an option that you have. And it's perfectly fine to do. It won't be flagged. It is valid HTML. And the purpose of it is just to give you a little bit more flexibility when you're adjusting the default layout of those with CSS. So an obvious use of a definition list is if I need to define a bunch of terms, right? So if I need to define what is WCAG, what is accessibility, what is viewport, right? If I wanted to have a little glossary with a blog post or something like that, very obvious use case for definition lists. But they're also helpful for any time that we have key value pairs that we need to present. So if you think about like a profile where you would have like your name, your email address, etc., like that's another place where definition lists are actually pretty helpful. All right, and then we have data tables. So you may have heard like, oh, don't use tables, they're bad for accessibility, but that's really not always true. So they are bad for accessibility if you're trying to use them to do your layout like it's 1998. Not a good idea anymore. We have so many fantastic options in CSS these days with Flexbox and Grid. You really don't need to use a table to achieve a reliable cross-browser, cross-device layout that's going to work reliably. And in fact, you're going to get way better results if you're using CSS to do those layouts instead of trying to do it in a table. Tables are pretty inflexible. So don't use them for layout any longer. And the other place where data tables can get a little bit sticky for accessibility is when they're very complex, where you have multiple layers of headings, or tables nested within tables. That gets to be a bit of a nightmare for accessibility. But a relatively straightforward table that has maybe a row of headers across the top, maybe a row of headers across the left side, one or the other or both, and then simple data in each of the cells. That's, as long as you mark it up correctly, that is reasonably accessible. So let's take a look at how to do that correctly, because I do see a lot of people missing certain parts of it or getting certain parts of it wrong. Okay, so the entire table gets wrapped in a table tag. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we have our closing table tag. The next thing that we want to have is a caption. So this is probably the number one thing that gets left out of tables. So we want to add a caption that explains what the table is for. What's a summary, right, of why is this table on the page? What is it presenting? And we want to have that there so that if somebody comes across your table with assistive technology and they're going to have to listen to your table because they can't see it, well, the first thing they want to know is, what even is this table? Is this something I'm even interested in listening to, right? So we want to include a caption so that they can tell immediately, is this a table I'm interested in or is it not? Because it's kind of annoying to have to go in and listen to all the table headings and table cells to decide if this is something you're interested in. So include the caption. Next up, we have a table head. So we're not going to just dive straight into having the table rows and table cells. We're going to actually create 3 sections of the table. So we have a table head, which is where we are saying, this is the head section of the table, right? It's those rows across the top of the table that are telling me what each column is for. And then I go into my table row and each of my TH items. So ideally, you should have TH instead of TDs inside of the table head. So TH are your header cells, which by default, the browser is going to style those bold. But of course, it is completely customizable with CSS. So if you want to change the colors, the borders, the text, like whatever you want, you can do it. Another thing that I see getting left out all the time is this scope attribute. So when you use a table header, it should have a scope attribute that tells me, is this a header for a column or is it a header for a row? So because these are all going across the top row of my table, they're each going to be labeling a column. And so they all have a scope of column. And then they have text inside of them that gives me a very clear idea of what is the content I can expect inside of that column of the table. All right, so that is our table head. Next, we'll head into the table body, which is where we have all of the data section of our table. And we're going to wrap the whole thing in there, and then all of our table rows will go inside. This particular table, each row is going to start with another table header. So this is my lunch order. I'm very hungry apparently because I'm having 2 hamburgers. Maybe they're little hamburgers. And I can see from looking up here, my first column says item, and it is a hamburger in the first column of this row. And you'll notice that I have a TH tag here, and there is a mistake. That is a TD, a closing TD. I need to fix that. So that's a closing TH cell. So there's a little error there that we'll fix. All right, so if you have an opening TH tag, you need a closing TH tag. But we again have this scope on here that tells me this time this header is labeling the row that goes across. So any of the information presented across this row is labeled by this very first cell, this very first table header. And then I have my second column is quantity. My third column is price. So 2 hamburgers, $10. My next row, I have fries, 1 for $2. This is a very affordable restaurant, I have to say, in 2025. All right, and then we have milkshakes. And I have that same mistake made all 3 rows. So I will come back and get that fixed so that these all have a closing TH tag. And I have 1 milkshake for $4. So my lunch total, and that is $10 total for 2 burgers, you guys. So whatever restaurant this is, we should all go there for lunch. All right, now we need to total up our lunch order. So we need a final row at the bottom. We're going to use a T foot tag to say that now we're in the footer of the table. Not all tables will have a T foot. If I was just using my table to list out a bunch of things, it may not have a T foot. In this case, I have a T foot because I am summarizing the order, basically, right? I'm calculating the total of the order. So we have a table row and then another TH tag. Hey, I got a closing TH tag this time, so that's good. And again, I have a scope of row because my total is labeling the total price. So my total price for lunch, $16. All right, so that is the correct markup of a table, and here is what it looks like. This is not quite the default appearance of a table. This has some CSS style applied to it to make it look a little bit nice. But you can see here is our T head is this top row of the table with 3 cells going across, which are all table headers. And they all tell me that they are labeling the column that they're on top of. And then we have table headers going down the left-hand side of the table, and they all tell me that they're labeling a row. So they're labeling this information that goes across. So what happens when somebody is navigating through this table with assistive technology is if they land on this number 2 in the quantity column, they will hear it read out as hamburger quantity 2, depending on which screen reader they're using. So it might be the other way around. They might hear quantity hamburger 2, but they're going to hear, because we have 1 TH that has a scope of row and 1 TH that has a scope of column, they're going to hear both of those read out before they hear the content of the cell, so that it's really easy to understand the context of that, right? If we don't have those table headers correctly marked up and we don't have the scope attributes there, they just hear 2. Well, what does that mean? 2 what? Right? So because we have it marked up correctly, they'll have that context, right? That, oh, 2 hamburgers for lunch. You must be really hungry, right? They have that context. They're able to make that. And then we see our caption appears right up here at the top of the table. By default, you can, again, style it with CSS. You can put it somewhere else on the page. You can make it look however you would like. You have control over what that looks like. I didn't add any extra styles. I have a little CSS library on here that this is how it presents a table by default. So that is how we do a correctly marked up table. All right, so some screen readers have built-in like navigation shortcuts for tables that are correctly marked up that make it a lot easier to get around the table and figure out what the content is in there. You can imagine if you couldn't see a table, it's actually kind of difficult to ingest that kind of tabular data orally, right? Like by listening, it's a little bit difficult to do. So we want to do everything we can to make sure that that data is understandable and ingestible for anybody who might come across it. All right, so we have our exercises here at the end of the unit. And again, if you want to follow along and try out these exercises, the website is Posh Foundations, altogether one word, .tech, and you will find your way around from there. And we have links out to the image sources, the solution markup, the solution styled. So you can figure out how you might structure this data. So if we take a look at this first exercise here, we have a navigation bar. So we've got looks like the company logo probably sitting over here on the left. Then we have a navigation item going across. So we're going to be combining some stuff that we learned last week because, of course, if we have a navigation, we would like that to be wrapped in one of our landmark roles that we covered last week. If you missed last week, it is available on both LinkedIn and YouTube. If you want to go back and catch up and follow along with it, you can. And all of the exercises that we did last week, all of the slides and everything that were presented are on this same website, so poshfoundations.tech. All right, so we could go ahead and if you want to just give some thought for a second about, okay, we got a logo, we have a navigation, and then we have, what's interesting is what looks like a couple of buttons, but are actually a couple of links probably, right? Because probably signing in is going to take me to a login page, and probably get started is going to take me to a sign up page where I can create an account. And because those are taking me to somewhere else, those would be links and not buttons, even though they appear to be buttons. Okay, so if we give some thought to how we might mark that up, and let's jump over to the solution markup on CodePen, and we'll just walk through the first exercise together, and I'll let you do the other ones on your own. All right, so I wrapped the entire thing in a header tag because I'm assuming, we don't have a lot of context in the little image that I provided, but I'm assuming that that's a header of a website. It looks like a header of a website. I guess it could technically be a footer. You could see something like that across the bottom of a page, but we'll assume it's a header. If you marked it up as a footer when you did the exercise, that's perfectly fine. Then we have a link wrapped around the image tag. That's the company's logo. And of course, we have the alt text there. And Rianne Wrightfall, I don't know if I'm saying her last name correctly, has a wonderful blog post where she goes through all of the different options that you have for alt text on a company logo that's typically found at the top left of a website design, and what should the alt text be. And this is her recommendation, is the name of the company plus the word logo, a comma, and then to homepage, because usually that is a link to the homepage. So you want to communicate both of those pieces of information, that this is a company logo and that it's a link that takes you to the homepage. So that's what I've done here. Then we have another landmark. We have a nav element. And navs are typically wrapped around unordered lists of links. So we have a UL, and then we have all of our LIs. And of course, I just had to make up URLs for where those might go off to. And in my particular case, because the sign in and the get started links at the end were also links, I just included them all as the same nav item. And then I'll just use, CSS Flexbox or CSS Grid to style those to look like they did in the image. If you made two separate ULs inside one nav, that would also be perfectly fine. If you made two separate navs, each with an unordered list of links inside of them, that is also perfectly fine. So all of those would be good solutions for how this should be marked up. All right. So that is our first exercise, and then just to prove that it could look like that, I did it just as a proof of concept, just so that you would know. You can mark that up as one nav with one list item inside of it and get this appearance. And I also touched up the accessibility of this button, which doesn't have a sufficient contrast with the background that's on. So I fixed that as well when I styled it. All right, so there's a couple more exercises here to work on. So if you want to try those out and then send them over to me, I'll take a look, let you know how you did. I do have, my solution is linked here, but again, my solution, not the only correct one. So if you do something different than what I did, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. And if you want me to take a look, I'm happy to do that for you. And let you know if yours follows best practices and would be accessible, or if there's maybe some improvement that could be made. So you could think about, how would you present this little profile card? How would you mark that up? And how would you present it? And then we're going to get really challenging and do this pricing table. And again, I tried to do both just the raw markup and how it might be styled to look at least somewhat similar to this. I think I had to make a few compromises on this one because it is a pretty challenging design to actually implement. So you can go ahead and try out those exercises. Oh, and then I forgot, we also have a table. So I found a nice table that you could take some practice. I don't know what this data is. It was the default data that was presented in the design, which is linked here. It's in the Figma community files that are freely available. And again, like, you could try your hand at marking up this table and see if you can figure out what all of the tags should be, where the table headers should go, what scope attributes they should have, and so on. So you've got 3 more exercises that you could try on your own later on. So just to summarize, that we would want to use lists and tables to express relationships between content programmatically, so that assistive technology visiting the page can understand it and help to communicate it to users. And it also helps, AI that might be scraping our websites and SEO bots that are coming to scrape our websites. It helps all of those different kinds of machines help to understand how our content is structured and how the different bits of content that are on the page relate to one another. So that's something that you should be thinking of when you are building out HTML pages. And if you're just building a blog post, it's usually pretty straightforward. But once you start building out, dashboards and pricing tables and calls to action, it's not always super clear exactly what the best semantic markup should be for that. So sometimes you do have to pause and give some thought to it and think about, what would users realistically expect and what would best communicate not just this chunk of content, but how this chunk of content relates to everything else on the page, so that the structure of the page overall is easy to understand, because we're going to be using landmarks and headings and buttons and links all correctly. But now we're also going to mix in those different kinds of lists and tables into the mix. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Unit 4. Oh, of course, I was thinking I could just do it from there, but I have to go over here and click it. All right, so Unit 4, links, buttons, and forms. Oh, I was thinking we did links and buttons last week. All right, well, we're doing it today. Surprise. I guess I misremembered. All right, so links versus buttons is one of the most common accessibility fails. I see it constantly. So the first thing that happens is, especially for developers who are using modern JavaScript frameworks like React, Vue, etc., those developers, they want everything to be a div. So please don't do that. If a user has to interact with it in any way, it should not be a div or a span. It should be a semantic tag. So we want to avoid using divs for everything. I'm sorry, I forgot to collapse the menu over here. Let me do that to get that out of our way. Avoid using divs or spans. Oh, Dave then says he's never used a definition list tag. Yes, definitely look into using those. They can be very useful sometimes. All right, so links and buttons. Don't use divs or spans. That's rule number 1. Please don't. If a user has to click on it, it should be either a link or a button. Which one should it be? Well, let's figure it out. All right, so links should go somewhere. So if the user clicks on it and it takes them to another page entirely, right, a different URL, it takes them to another place on the same page, right, usually using the hash or the pound sign, the number sign, the octothorpe, whatever you call it, right? Usually that's how that happens. Or, if we're talking about a React app or a Vue app, it's taking them to another view, another component, something like that. That's all going to count as going somewhere else. And so we're going to want to use a link for that case. And here's how that might look. Of course, when we go to another page, you just use an href attribute and you put in the URL where they are going. You can use a relative URL or an absolute URL and take them off somewhere else. We want to go to a section on a page, so just a different place on the same page. We can do that by using that hash, octothorpe, whatever you want to call it, in front of what is usually an ID on the page, right? So typically what I would expect here is that I've got an area on the page. It could be any tag. It doesn't matter what the tag is, but it has an ID of contact. And when I click this link, I'm going to jump to that section of the page that has an ID of contact, right? It could be an actual section tag. It could be a div. It could be something else. It doesn't matter. It has an ID of contact, and I'm going to jump to it. If it's a link to download a file, that is also something that I would want to use a link for. And I would just have the href point at where my file is. And this very nice attribute gets overlooked a lot, which is the download attribute. You can include the download attribute and not set it equal to anything. That will work as well. When the user clicks that link, it will just automatically in their browser, it will download the file with the name that you have given it, right? So here we see report.pdf. So if you had download without the equals and without a value assigned to it, just download sitting there by itself, when the user downloaded that, they would just get report.pdf. But you can also pass a value to download. And when they download the file, it will get this name instead. So company report 2025.pdf. So that is an option that you have if you are providing downloadable files. You can use the download attribute. And then if we're using a modern JavaScript framework, this is what we would want to do. We have a link. We would put some kind of href and then an onClick attribute that would say, call some kind of method that's going to navigate me over to the new component or a new route, root or route. Sometimes I say those interchangeably. I'm sorry, English is weird. Router, router, route, root. It's the same thing. So we might be going to a new route, and that's how we would do it. All right, so that is correct usage of links. Let's look at buttons. So buttons, in contrast to links, do something. So they're not taking us anywhere else, but they might open a modal, they might open a custom select dropdown, they might toggle an accordion or switch tabs in a set of tabs. And of course, they can submit a form, which is famously the very first use that ever existed for buttons. All right, so a regular old button. So we wanted to open a modal or toggle an accordion. This is how we would mark it up. We would use a button tag and we assign a type of button. Now, we do have to assign a type of button because the default value of that type attribute is submit. And so if you are building, some kind of a custom form component, right? Some kind of a custom input field in a form and you forget to put type button, when the user clicks that, it's going to submit the form, which is probably not what you want. So if it's not supposed to submit a form, make sure that you assign the type of button. And then inside of it, buttons are very flexible. You can have all kinds of content inside them. So if you want to add an icon, you can do that. I would recommend not doing an icon alone, but I know that sometimes that's unavoidable. Some text. The text should tell you what the button does so that users understand. I just have click me here, which isn't the very best example. It doesn't tell me anything about what the button does. Yes, Veronica, the video will be available afterward on both LinkedIn and YouTube. So if you've missed the beginning of it, no worries. You can catch up with it later, or if you need to leave us, you can catch the rest of it later. All right, so that is a regular old button. It's a type of button. It can also have like a span inside of it if you need to do something fancy with CSS. Buttons are very flexible. But you want to make sure that it's got text in it that tells the user what it does. That's the most important thing. Submit button. Here I've specifically said type submit. Technically, you don't have to do that because it is the default value of type. Just putting a button will make it a submit button. And here I did a better job of having some nice text. Subscribe tells me exactly what's going to happen when I click that button. I'm going to subscribe to something, right? And then here is how we would style a toggle button. So if we have a menu in this case, and we wanted to open and close it, right? So if we think about the little hamburger menu, right? We want to open and close a menu. Here is how we would correctly mark that up. This gets done incorrectly a lot because some of the ARIA attributes and things get missed. So let's take a look at what it is. So we have a button. We're going to say type a button because we don't want to submit a form when we are opening or closing our navigation. That wouldn't make any sense. I'm going to assume it is closed by default. So it's going to get an ARIA expanded set equal to false. And then it's going to have an ARIA controls, which is going to have the ID of the element that I'm showing and hiding when I click this button, so that programmatically my menu and the button that opens and closes my menu are tied together. I am going to put an ID on my button, and then this would be followed by a nav, probably, that would have an ID of menu content, so that my button is tied to my menu and assistive technology can understand, oh, this button is toggling this nav that's available over here. They don't have to be right next to each other. It's probably going to save you a lot of headache if they are, whenever possible, but it could be somewhere else entirely on the page. So that is an option as well. And here we have markup for a button that opens a dialog or a modal on the page. So again, we have button of a type button. And now we want to say ARIA has pop-up equals dialog, because we're going to open a dialog when we click that button. And again, we want to have ARIA controls on there and have the ID of the item that's going to open or close when we click this button. And I have an ID on there just in case I need to refer to it later, and then some text that explains what this button does. And again, if you need to put a little icon next to this text, if you need the word open to be styled differently from the word details, you can wrap a span around one of those words. Buttons are very flexible. Okay, let's take a look at how we can handle icon-only buttons. So avoid them if you can, because icons are not as straightforward as you think. Icons that you might think, oh, that's universal. Everybody knows that the magnifying glass means search, but does it mean search or does it mean zoom? So that's a really common example it's a very common icon that we see everywhere, but it explicitly has two different meanings, two very common different meanings. So be thoughtful about that. Icons by themselves are rarely enough information for users of any sort, whether they have disabilities or not. So we're going to look at some ways that we can handle those. So here I am using the ARIA label attribute. So I have a button tag. I'm giving it a type button, so we know it's not submitting a form. And I'm going to use the ARIA label attribute to ensure that while this button doesn't have visible text on the page, it is going to have some kind of text that a screen reader or other assistive technology can pick up and communicate to the reader, or to the user rather. And then I just have my icon inside of there. So this is a good kind of approach if you can't do anything better, but it has a few drawbacks, and I think that we should probably talk about them. So first is we have users who are navigating around and trying to use websites with their voice, and they are not going to necessarily be able to guess this string of text to say click the search button. They won't necessarily know what text you've put in there to be able to direct, with their voice to say, click that button. And they have a workaround that they can use, but it's a little bit of a hassle. And it's easier if there's visible text that they can just say, click the search button, because they can see that search text there. Another problem with ARIA label is that, like if you visit a website that's in a different language, there's a little button here on the bar that lets you translate the whole page to your own language. It will not translate the ARIA label. It's only going to translate text that's inside the button tag, it won't translate the attributes. So that's another thing. If somebody is trying to translate your content, they're not going to get that translation. And then also, there's an issue that not all users are going to know or understand what your icon is about. And so putting text on there, but making it hidden so that only somebody using assistive technology gets that text is not ideal. You're creating a barrier there for sure. So do think about that. Like, be careful, be really thoughtful about icon only buttons. I know that sometimes we can't avoid them, but we should try to do something better anytime that we can. Another option that we have is to use screen reader only text. So here I have the same text, but it's inside a span in the button, and it's given a class of SR only. So in your CSS, you would have to write out this CSS class to make that text so it's available to assistive technology, but it's hidden from view. So the advantage that this approach has over ARIA label is that if the user translates the page, this text would get translated. But that's the only problem it solves. We still have the problem that users trying to navigate by voice can't see what the name of our button is if they want to direct the browser to click on it. And then, of course, sighted users just get the icon and they may not understand what the icon is. So we still have that problem. We haven't solved that problem, which is why the best solution is always to avoid an icon-only button and to actually have the text visible on it. Let's see here. Screen reader only text. Okay, we're going to keep going. We can use an alt attribute. So here I've got a button with an image inside of it, and I've put alt text on the image that's nested inside. It won't get translated, and it's still not visible to users, but it is another option that we have. We can also use the title attribute of an SVG. So for example, if we have an SVG, our SVG can have a title attribute with our text. We still have the same problem where we've provided a name for the robots and for assistive technology, but we don't have a visible name for sighted users who might be coming along. And you can do that, as a title attribute on the SVG or an actual title tag inside the SVG. Either one of those will work to give the icon a title. All right, so we want to use native HTML elements whenever it is possible to do so. If you aren't somebody who uses a keyboard-only navigation on a regular basis, if you're somebody who doesn't routinely use assistive technology, you may not even be aware of some of the functionality that these default HTML elements have. And what that means is that when you try to replace them with a div or a span or something else, that you're probably going to forget some of the functionality that users who do routinely use keyboard-only navigation or routinely use assistive technology, things that they rely on are going to be missing. And that is mostly because you as a developer weren't aware that those were even functionalities that those elements had out of the box. And so it's really easy to forget to implement something, which is why it is best whenever you can to just use the native HTML element. You get your accessibility for free. You don't have to write tons of extra ARIA attributes on things. You don't have to write tons of JavaScript to write, like if you add an on-click attribute to a div, that's great if you can use a mouse, but you can't tab to that. You can't tab to that div, right? And you can't get a voice-controlled accessibility tool to get over there. So you can't even get focus over to it, and you can't click it with a keyboard, right? Like you can't hit the enter key or the spacebar key on the keyboard and activate that fake button, right? And chances are that even if you're trying to be really thoughtful and careful, you're going to forget at least one of the things that you need to do to try to emulate it. And even if you get it perfect, and you try to emulate in JavaScript and ARIA attributes and CSS, you try to emulate all of that default behavior that that HTML element would have, it is just simply not going to work as reliably across different browsers, on different devices, and different assistive technologies as the native HTML element. So use the native HTML elements whenever you can. So I have this example here where I have a div, and you can see that I've had to assign it a role of button. I have to assign it a tab index of 0. I have to put an on-click handler. I also have to add an on-key down handler. Now, I would need the on-click handler even if it was a button, but the benefit I get if it is a button, the browser is automatically going to put the keyboard handler on there for me. I don't have to do it explicitly. If I'm faking a button with a div, I have to also handle the key down event. And then I also have a class, a fake button, that I have to use now to style this to look like a button. Whereas, of course, if I just used a native HTML button, it would look like a button automatically. And here's my CSS that I'm using to make that look like a button. And then, of course, I have to write a whole bunch of JavaScript, right? If it was a native HTML button, I would still have to write this function, right? I would still have to handle a click of whatever I wanted to happen, but I wouldn't have to write this one, right? And potentially there's other JavaScript that you would have to add in here, depending on exactly what your button is doing. But we have to do a whole bunch of extra work there. Easy to miss stuff, like I already said. And we're also increasing the accessibility debt on the project every time we add a new div to the page with an on-click attribute on it, or a new span with an on-click attribute. We're increasing that tech debt that we have in our code repository. And it's just something that we're going to have to come back and fix later. All right, so accessible forms have labels. All right, we're going to dive into forms. So this happens way too much, everybody, where we don't put an actual label. We use a placeholder instead, which of course disappears as soon as the user starts typing. And then it gets very confusing. So I had a case actually where I was filling in a form. I think it had 8 fields. I got interrupted in the middle. I had to go answer the door. Some package was arriving. I had to go sign for something. Came back to my computer and had no idea what I had filled in these forms. No idea what I had filled in because they only used a placeholder. And of course, once I had typed my answers into the form field, the placeholder is not visible anymore. And I literally had to go back through this form, delete every field, and then paste it back in so that I could check over the form and make sure that it was okay to submit. You have to figure out a way to design your forms so that having visible labels on the form fields doesn't make it feel cluttered or too messy. Those labels are vitally important for helping users understand how to use your form. So don't use placeholders. Don't skip the label altogether. Understand how to tie your label to your form field. So that gets done incorrectly all the time. It is the for attribute here should refer to the ID attribute of the input. It's not the name attribute. That gets mixed up a lot. It is the ID attribute. So for refers to the ID. And then it should have some text inside of it. Your label should have some text inside of it that explains the purpose of that form field. Again, you do have the option of using ARIA label here to provide a label, but we've already discussed all the problems that there are with ARIA label. So avoid that if you can. If at all possible, you should avoid using ARIA label to label your form fields. All right, we actually have 2 different ways of associating a label with a form field. One is the explicit way, which is what we just talked about. We have a for attribute on the label and an ID attribute on the input, and those 2 values match is what we're looking for. And basically, when focus lands on this input, the browser is going to announce the label. So we land here, it's going to say, oh, there's a text input, name is what that is called. And so the user understands what that form field is and what information they need to type in there. We can also do an implicit form label, which looks like this. We basically just wrap the label around the input. You'll probably find that this is pretty difficult to deal with styling wise. It's really difficult to get a particular layout when you're using this. It can be pretty handy for checkboxes and radio buttons because usually those are pretty simple. We just want the checkbox, the radio button, and the text next to it. So it can be really handy for those, but it's not super helpful for the other types of form inputs. Because it's really hard to control where the actual label text ends up displaying on the screen. And if you want it above the input or to the side of the input, or you want a space between the label and the input, that's a lot harder to do with the implicit form label. So it's really just a CSS layout issue that makes it difficult, but keep that in mind because you can use the explicit form label to get a little bit more flexibility. And then with the explicit form label, also the label and the form element don't necessarily need to be right next to each other in your markup. Again, it's a good idea if it is, because for maintainability and for your own sanity, you might want it there. But if there's something going on and you need some other markup in between the two, that's an option if you're using the explicit form label. You can help out users a lot by using the correct autocomplete values for different form fields. So users can share almost a shocking amount of data in their browsers to be auto-filled into forms. Their names, their addresses, their phone numbers, their credit card numbers, which is surprising to me, but all of that can actually be saved into your browser and is available to be filled in automatically into forms. But it only works if you use the correct autocomplete attributes. So I do have a link here on the slide. And again, if you want to follow along with the slides, it's poshfoundations.tech. You'll see all of these exact slides that I'm presenting here on that website. You can follow along and click all of the links. So I do have the link to MDM that it's going to tell you all of the correct autocomplete attributes to assign. So for example, for first name, it is given name is what you would want to fill in there. And it will automatically fill in somebody's given name, which is not their first name in all cultures, right? So we don't want to call it the first name. So that's why it gets called given name. Email autocomplete is pretty easy. It's an email. And again, like you can see the whole list at this link at MDN. It is really helpful for users. It saves them a lot of typing, right? Typing is really difficult for some users because maybe they don't have control over the movement of their hands, or maybe they don't have hands at all, and it can be really challenging. So if we can save some keystrokes and make it a little bit easier to fill in a form, then we should take the opportunity to do that. All right, and then sometimes form fields should be put together in a group. So another way, right, we talked about unordered lists, ordered lists, and definition lists as ways of grouping content. I guess tables also fall into that group, a way of grouping content together and saying, here's a hunk of data that all goes together. Sometimes we have the same thing with form fields. So a set of radio buttons, for example. Right? We have this choose your preferred contact method that acts as kind of a label for the entire set. And I can choose one. With checkboxes, of course, you can choose multiples. So if you want to choose a couple, you can. Radio buttons, you can only choose one. Of course, if you choose a different one, it's going to deselect the one that you had before. And then here we have a set of address fields, right? My street, my city, my state, my zip code, or my postal code, depending on what country I'm in. All go together as a unit, right? Like your address isn't just the city you live in. It's not just your zip code, right? All of those fields have to go together. Oops, sorry. I have another meeting at 2:00. All of those fields have to go together to form your address. So how do we communicate that form fields go together? We use a field set. And this gets neglected way too often. So please use field sets. Anytime that you have a set of radio buttons or a set of checkboxes, they should be wrapped in a field set. If you have just like a little single checkbox on its own that's like, yes, I accept the terms of service, that doesn't have to be in a field set. But if you have more than one, it should be wrapped in a field set. And then you use the very first child of the field set has to be a legend. You can't put the legend anywhere else. If for styling reasons you need to put a div inside of your field set, it has to come after the legend, right? So you would open your div here and then you can close it right before the closing field set. That's perfectly fine to do, but the legend has to be the first child of the field set. And the legend is that label for the entire set of form fields. So here we have the radio buttons we saw on the last slide, choose your preferred contact method. And I'm using the implicit label association because they're radio buttons and they're very simple layout. And I have that all set up. So for a set of radio buttons, they all get the same name. They have different values. And we just say an input type of radio. Okay, let's look at checkboxes. So very similar. We have a field set, a legend. This legend text here acts as the label for the overall group of checkboxes altogether. Again, they get the same name and they get different values. And those will get sent, like if you select multiples, they get sent to the backend server as an array of values. So if you picked technology and design, it would be sent to the backend as an array of technology and design. All right, and then our address field, it's the same thing. We have a field set, we have a legend that acts as the label for the entire group. And then we have our individual fields, each with a label, an explicit label that is attached. And because we're being super nice, we added our autocomplete attributes on here with all of the correct names. And you can see that those are not always intuitive. So do go check out that MDN link that I included a couple of slides ago so that you can figure out what autocomplete value you should use, because I don't think anybody would guess address level 1 would be state. So they've had to make them very generic so that they work across all the different countries and all the different regions of the world. And so we do have some unexpected things in there like this. Like you wouldn't ever say city, you would say address level 2. So do be thoughtful about using those and make sure that you are looking it up and making sure that the one that you are using is a correct one. All right, if we have required form fields, we're going to do that by including the required attribute on the form field. So here's what that looks like. So we've just got the required attribute hanging out here at the end by itself. It doesn't need a value. So we just add that on there. And now programmatically, this input is marked as required. So screen reader user will hear that lands on this input. It'll hear email required. They will hear required twice because we have put it in the label name and we have put it over here. That is a little bit unfortunate, but we do want to include it visibly in the label for sighted users so that they can understand which fields are required. I know that you may be used to seeing an asterisk next to required fields, but that doesn't actually communicate information successfully. So we actually do want to use the word required next to the form field so that all the users can understand that that is the required form field, whether they can see it or they hear it, or they pick it up on a Braille device if they can neither see nor hear. All right. So this is especially important little bit of content here because this is constantly done incorrectly, where I have a form field with a label, and then I have my form field, and then I have this little bit of instructions that gives users a hint about how they should fill in that username. Yes, David, I don't think anybody could guess those autocomplete names. They're completely wild. They're very unpredictable. So, sometimes they're very straightforward, but other ones are completely unpredictable. So always look them up if you're going to use them. So the problem is that what happens a lot of the time is that we'll correctly put the label in here, but then this is just a paragraph or a span hanging out with this information. And the issue is that's not programmatically tied to that form field. So screen reader users, if they're in forms mode, which is a special mode that screen readers have that helps users more efficiently fill in forms, they're not going to hear those instructions at all, which can be very frustrating. So we want to make sure that we're programmatically tying any of our instructions or error messages about a field to the field. And how we do that is like this. We assign an ID to our extra instructions. So I have a paragraph tag with an ID of username help. And then on the input itself, I use an ARIA described by attribute that refers to that ID. And now my instructions are programmatically tied to my form field. Screen reader users or other assistive technology users are going to get not just the form label, but my instructions, which they would miss out on if I didn't use this ARIA described by. All right, exercise time. So I have a starting code pen with a badly marked up form that has mistakes in it. And you can go over there and correct the form. So I'd be really excited if any of you want to try that exercise and then send it over to me to review. You can just fork the code pen and create your own copy of it. And then put that in the comments on YouTube or LinkedIn so that I can take a look. So fixing this form is the first exercise here. Oh, that is the only exercise here. All right, so that is the only exercise on this one. So we want to make sure that we're correctly using links and buttons. We want to make sure that we have all of our links and buttons marked up correctly. We want to make sure all of our form fields have labels and that any instructions are correctly attached to the form fields. And we want to make sure that we're using semantic HTML elements wherever possible. All right, so try out that exercise. And then we'll pick up next time. We will finish up the last 2 units here, which are semantic HTML elements you may not know. And you can try those. We'll learn about those, some really handy, newer additions to HTML, compared to how old HTML is, newer elements in HTML. And then we'll take a look at using semantic HTML if you are using React, Vue, Ember, Angular, whatever. We want to focus on using semantic HTML, and we'll look at how we can do that in those different frameworks. All right, so I hope you will join me 2 weeks from today. We'll go over those 2 units. If you want to send exercises to me for Unit 3 or Unit 4, I'd love to see them. And otherwise, I will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for joining me today and staying over a couple of minutes late. I appreciate it so much. I hope you have a wonderful day and enjoy autumn. Thank you.